Hi, I'm Catherine Amirfar. As president of the American Society of International Law, I'm privileged to introduce the latest installment of our online series on international law and the 2020 election. With this series, the Society brings to you the most important questions relating to international law that are at play leading up to the 2020 election in just a few short weeks. The subject for this program is international law and cybersecurity. Among other questions, our esteemed speakers will be addressing what they view as the most serious cyber threats in the upcoming election and what the administration is doing to address those threats. With that, I turn it over to David Bowker, Chair of the International Litigation Practice at WilmerHale in Washington, D.C., Vice President of the Society, and Chair of the Program Committee that has been responsible for this remarkable series.
Hi, my name is David Bowker. I'm the chair of the Program Committee of the American Society of International Law. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Ambassador Robert C. O'Brien, the 28th National Security Advisor of the United States. He previously served in this administration as Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs at the Department of State and has served prior administrations in a variety of capacities. He also served as a Judge Advocate General in the U.S. Army Reserve in different roles and spent years in various international organizations as a U.S. representative. He's a graduate of Berkeley Law and of UCLA undergrad, and he'll be speaking to us about international law and national security, including especially cybersecurity affairs and efforts to protect U.S. elections from cyber meddling and foreign influence. Without further ado, sincere thanks to Ambassador Robert C. O'Brien.
Good morning. Thank you, David, for that gracious introduction. It is a privilege to be here with you, my ASIL colleagues, to discuss cybersecurity and election security. I'm a longtime member of the American Society of International Law. Cybersecurity is national security. As we move into an era of the Internet of Things, AI, quantum computing, 5G, automated transport, and remote work, there is little we can accomplish as a nation without robust cybersecurity. We must protect our personal data, our intelligence, our communications, our intellectual property, our power grid, our banking system, our voting systems, and all other critical infrastructure. Our adversaries are currently leveraging cyber tools to advance their interest, often at our expense. For decades, the Chinese Communist Party has hacked U.S. companies to steal intellectual property and technology to the tune of $30 billion per year. Such theft is not just an economic issue. It seriously erodes our military qualitative edge over our adversaries. We simply cannot afford to spend billions on military modernization only to have our capabilities copied or compromised by the time they are fielded. In order to partially address this issue, the Department of Defense recently unveiled a new cybersecurity standard for the defense industrial base and advanced procurement changes to hold companies accountable for security alongside cost, schedule, and performance. As Director Wray made clear in his June speech on the PRC threat, the Chinese Communist Party has used cyber tools to steal the personal data of over 100 million Americans. Their names, birth dates, social security numbers, credit scores, passport numbers, and health information. And how will the CCP use our data? The same way they use it within China's borders, to, among other things, target, to flatter, to cajole, to influence, to coerce, and even to blackmail Americans to say and do things that serve the party's interest. Social credit scores are a reality in China, and there is no doubt that the Chinese Communist Party will have social credit scores for each of us soon if they've not done so already. At the height of the COVID pandemic, Chinese state-sponsored hackers targeted the biopharmaceutical industry and U.S. universities for information and research related to vaccines and therapeutics. Last month, the Justice Department indicted Chinese actors working for the Ministry of State Security for their hacking of COVID-19 research. Russia has also deployed hackers to further its geopolitical goals. Like China, Russian cyber actors are targeting COVID-19 vaccine development in Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Under President Trump, the Justice Department is aggressively investigating and prosecuting economic espionage. Director Wray recently announced the FBI opens a new China-related counterintelligence case approximately every 10 hours, with a total of more than 1,000 ongoing investigations into China's actual attempted theft of American technology. The Trump administration has blocked certain companies that answer to the Chinese Communist Party and their intelligence apparatuses, such as the Chinese telecommunications giant Huawei, from participating in our 5G infrastructure. Further, the Commerce Department has severely restricted the sale of advanced microchips to Huawei. In keeping with this focus on information communication technology security, this spring, President Trump signed a national strategy to ensure the security, reliability, and trustworthiness of our 5G and future generations of telecommunications infrastructure. The good news is that our allies and partners are taking similar action. The UK has joined other democracies such as the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Romania, and Sweden by committing to use trusted suppliers for future 5G networks. Telecommunications carriers like Jio in India, Telstra in Australia, SK and KT in South Korea, NTT in Japan, and others have also prohibited the use of Huawei equipment in their networks. The president has taken steps via executive order to prevent the Chinese Communist Party from getting its hands on Americans' personal data via seemingly innocent mobile applications such as TikTok and WeChat. In the 21st century, data is a key element of power. Access to these apps will be severely curtailed in the coming weeks. President Trump has also made it a priority to recruit and retain the best and brightest technologists, and the administration is overhauling its HR systems accordingly. There's just no substitute for talent in this critical area. Fortunately, we have an abundance of tech talent in this country, but the world is getting more competitive, and we need to educate and cultivate the next generation of innovators and cyber warriors. Our policy recognizes the importance of international law in cyberspace, which is why we are working to promote a framework for responsible state behavior. State practice in cyberspace is still emerging and evolving. Certain customary international law principles governing state-on-state behavior function in cyberspace no differently than they do in any other domain, as do the norms of responsible state behavior in peacetime. For example, the UN Charter and the core principles of the law of armed conflict, the principles of distinction, humanity, necessity, and proportionality are and should be no different for military operations in cyberspace than for operations carried out on land, at sea, or in the air. Just like a missile or an artillery shell, cyber operations can constitute the use of force within the meaning of the UN Charter when they cause physical injury or damage. Cyber operations can also violate customary international law prohibition on intervention in another state's sovereign affairs. The exact boundaries of the latter principle, frequently described as the international law prohibition on intervention, remain the subject of continued debate. It is clear that certain activities, for instance, tampering with a state's election results, would be a clear violation of this non-intervention principle. Sovereignty is a bedrock principle of international law. There is no substitute for an international order based on strong sovereign states. But owing to the interconnected nature of networks, cyber operations defy traditional concepts of geography. There has not yet been sufficient state practice to create standalone rules of sovereignty for cyberspace. To the contrary, we have seen the extensive conduct of cyber operations by a number of states that involve computers located on another state's territory. This practice raises the issue of whether there is or should be an international law prohibition against cyber operations solely because the ops traverse the territory of another state. The absence of a customary international law principle regarding non-consensual cyber operations is not, however, a blank check for states to operate without regard to legal principles in the cyber domain. Again, international law regarding the use of force and coercive interventions into the affairs of another sovereign state are no different in cyberspace than they are in other domains. Let me emphasize our view that if a foreign adversary seeks to interfere in the U.S. elections this fall, we will not sit idly by. The U.S. intelligence community has not yet seen any indications that a foreign actor has successfully affected the votes cast in a U.S. election. Nevertheless, China, Russia, Iran, and other foreign adversaries continue to use covert methods in an attempt to influence measures to sway U.S. voters' preferences and perspectives. Those powers may attempt more aggressive cyber attacks as we approach Election Day, and thus we will remain vigilant. China attempts to influence U.S. officials at the federal, state, and local levels. America's tough stance on China in matters of trade, the military, and international diplomacy has made the Trump administration a target for these Chinese influence operations. We have seen China ramping up such efforts ahead of this November's election. This administration is sustaining its maximum pressure on Iran to cease its hostile activities in the Middle East and constrain its development of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. In response, Iran has attempted to influence the election by spreading disinformation and anti-U.S. rhetoric online and is attempting to sow division and unrest in our country. The Iranian regime has also targeted administration officials through hacking. As it has in the past, Russia is using a range of divisive measures, especially in the social media realm, to spread discord ahead of the election. Russia's ultimate goal is the destabilization of the United States and other liberal democracies in the West. On a personal note, I served on International Republican Institute election observation teams in the 2013 Republic of Georgia presidential election and the 2014 Ukrainian presidential parliamentary elections. Both countries border Russia, and we were there to ensure free and fair elections given the Russian occupation of portions of both nations' territories. I am well aware of how Russia attempts to interfere in its democratic neighbors. As a national security advisor, I will do everything I can to protect our upcoming elections from Russian or any other type of interference. We take all of these threats very seriously. If a foreign adversary interferes in our election, the United States will make use of the full range of options to respond. In international law, this means that if another state violates our sovereignty, we will defend ourselves and engage in countermeasures. Traditionally, countermeasures are proportional actions that respond to another state's wrongful act. They are often preceded by notice to the offending state. In the context of securing our elections, however, the need to carry out operations secretly and quickly may make notice impossible in the time frame required to counter the threat. To prepare for threats to our elections, President Trump signed legislation to provide states with nearly $800 million in assistance and established election infrastructure, government, and sector coordinating councils. Under its Rewards for Justice program, the State Department is offering a reward of up to $10 million for information leading to the identification or location of any person working with a foreign government who interferes with U.S. elections through illegal cyber activities. We have delivered blunt messages to our adversaries that interfering in our elections via cyber attacks or otherwise is a red line. President Trump has demonstrated the administration's resolve in the past, so we expect our warnings on elections to be heeded. While the threats are real, our election system is resilient. There is diversity in our election systems. They include multiple checks and redundancies, and over 90% of voters will cast their ballots with an auditable paper record in November. These characteristics make it difficult for foreign adversaries to disrupt or change vote tallies on election night. Free and fair elections are the cornerstone of American democracy. The United States government will not hesitate to leverage the full spectrum of national power in defense of our elections. Thank you very much. God bless you, and may God bless America.
It's my privilege to introduce Christopher Painter. Chris Painter is a globally recognized leader and expert on cyber policy, cyber diplomacy, and combating cybercrime. He's been on the vanguard of U.S. and international cyber issues for over 25 years. First, as a leading federal prosecutor of some of the most high-profile cybercrime cases in the country, then as a senior official at the Department of Justice, a senior director for cyber policy at the White House National Security Council, and finally as the world's first top cyber diplomat at the State Department in the Obama administration. Please join me in welcoming Chris.
Hi, I'd like to thank the American Society on International Law for hosting this important conversation, given some of the threats we're facing in cyberspace, and particularly during this election year. As I see it, in 2016, we really got a wake-up call. And unfortunately, although we've done some to respond to that wake-up call about foreign interference and cyber hacking, we really haven't done enough. As I look at the threats, the cyber threats that this election is facing, I categorize them into three categories. One are attacks on election infrastructures, the voting machines themselves, the voting tabulation, the voting announcements. So that's one category, and that's more of a traditional cyber attack or theft of information in an attempt to change votes. So that's one category. The second is what we saw really rampantly in 2016, and we expect again to see this year, which is social media, and manipulation of social media and disinformation that could exploit existing divisions in our society by foreign actors, particularly by Russia. It also can be powered by not just the social media, but also by theft of cyber information. We saw that in 2016 with the theft of emails and the use of those, the weaponization of those in social media. And the third type is cyber actions that are meant to foster doubt in the integrity of our democratic system, to really undermine the integrity of our voting system and to cause doubt in our public, which would undermine all of our trust in this area. Now, we have done some good things over the last few years, but I'd say not enough. The Department of Homeland Security, I think, has done some really good work working with the state and local election officials, and we have many of them, to try to help them harden their targets and have better defenses to be able to respond to these issues, to share information with them. So that's really good. But unfortunately, those efforts have been largely unfunded or underfunded. There's been some funding, but not nearly enough. Congress hasn't acted on a lot of the funding that's needed there. So good action, but not enough. We've also seen some good efforts by the FBI in terms of notifying victims of potential disinformation. And I think that's a really good initiative as well. And good actions by both the FBI and our military, U.S. Cyber Command, to disrupt particularly foreign interference operations. Again, those are good efforts, but they're somewhat piecemeal. They're not really unified by an overall strategic plan that we need to bring all these things together and treat this really as a core national priority for all of us. Indeed, I think that we really would need to treat this as, somewhat of almost like a Manhattan Project, have everyone really focus on this, have a task force that's dedicated to this, and we're just not treating it at a national level, at an administration level, as the priority we need. The third area where I think we've made some progress, but again, not enough, is the area of deterrence. So we've done some, if you're trying to keep these malicious actors, particularly malicious state actors, from interfering on our election, you have to do more than say that it's bad. You have to actually take action, impose costs, make it clear to them that in their calculus, this is not going to benefit them, this is actually going to harm them. And this is something I think we have not done a very good job doing overall, and that's been very unfortunate. We've done some work, we've done some sanctions, economic sanctions against Russia, but even those have been somewhat inconsistent, where we've imposed them and then we've lifted them. We've taken some other actions that I think have been helpful, as I mentioned before, but all of those have been significantly undercut by messaging from the top, by the president himself, who often doubts that election interference even happened. And the problem with that kind of inconsistency in messaging from the president himself is that it emboldens the bad actors. If I'm Vladimir Putin and I think I'm going to get a benefit out of interfering with our elections, and the costs I'm going to pay are nominal or minimal or not really going to affect me, and overall the US president is saying it's not happening and is not even blaming me, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to be emboldened not just to do it again, but to do it even stronger than I did back in 2016. And worse yet, other potential actors who are thinking about taking action, again, if it benefits them, would be emboldened by the lack of action on the US and that lack of messaging. So that's a critical issue. That also applies to the issue of the last area of threat that I raised, which was the actions that are taken to undermine the integrity of the election or the perception of integrity of the election. There is a movie, The Conversation, famous movie from many years ago, starring Gene Hackman, where he plays a surveillance expert who believes that there is a surveillance bug placed in his house, and he tears an entire house apart, thinking that's the case when in fact there's no bug there. And that's similar to what we're afraid of here, that even if no interference actually took place, and I'd submit that we're likely to see some interference, that if the public believes that our elections are not secure, if the public believes that they're being manipulated, if the public believes that they're being fixed or influenced, that destroys the integrity of the process and really undercuts our democratic system as a whole. And again, here, unfortunately, what we've seen is, and most recently, the president calling doubt on whether these elections have integrity at all and saying the elections will be fixed if he doesn't win. And that's a real, I think, issue. No matter who's in office, we need to inspire confidence in these systems, not undermine them. Now, the last thing I'd say about our efforts here is that social media companies, I think, have taken some actions, and they've taken some actions working with the government as well. Those are good to try to ferret out disinformation and to expose it. But again, I'd say that has been not as much as we need. You know, certainly Facebook and Twitter have done some really good actions, but we really need to build on those as well. So we face these serious election threats. We have responses that have been, you know, somewhat good, but not really enough. And where we are is we don't have that national level from the top leadership of this is a priority issue for all of us. And that should be true whether it's Republicans or Democrats. It should not be a politicized issue. Unfortunately, it's become one. And then that raises a question of what is the role of international law in cyberspace more generally, with respect to election interference, to be sure, but with respect to cyberspace more generally. And I think it plays a very important role. Just a few years ago, there was an agreement reached between a number of countries, including the US, Russia, China, and others, that international law applies in cyberspace, and that's foundational. There was some doubt before that the international law really applied in cyberspace, and then maybe you needed a whole new construct for international law, and you don't. Now, that the fact that it applies, though, is a threshold issue and an important one. Things like the international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, other international law applying, that's really important, and the UN Charter. There's not real agreement yet on how international law applies. So we need to really focus on how we can do that, how we can build on that, and to make sure that, that international law has meaning in this context. Now, there's been a number of efforts underway, something called the Talon Manual, which was out of Estonia, which a number of legal experts worked on to try to answer some of those questions. But there's still a lot to do in terms of how international law applies. With respect to election interference, there's a lot of question of how it applies in that context. And I would say that there is a principle of international law on non-interference, and this is international customary law. And I think that clearly would apply to attempts to actually attack the election infrastructures. So there's settled international law, but there's also been a number of international efforts around setting what the rules of the road are in cyberspace. Understanding that international law is often a very high threshold. Are there things below that very high threshold that might trigger, for instance, a country's or a nation's right to self-defense that we should focus on? And those are basically voluntary rules of the road. And those might become, over time, customary international law or even a rule-based international law, but it's important for countries to start thinking about and agreeing on these. And some of the important ones that have been agreed to by, again, not just the US and the Western world, but also Russia and China, are norms of behavior, voluntary norms of behavior, including don't attack the critical infrastructure of another country, and don't attack the computer emergency response teams of another country, and a number of what we call norms of restraint, but also norms of cooperation. Now let's take that critical infrastructure one for a moment and think about how that might apply in the election context. I think it's clear now, if it wasn't clear in 2016, that our election infrastructure is a critical infrastructure. It really underlies our democracy. So attempts and actual success in attacking that critical infrastructure, I think, should be sanctioned under this agreement, that this norm, this voluntary norm, and there should be consequences for those who violate that. I think that there's been some work by other groups, including a group I served as a commissioner on. I was a commissioner on the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, which brought together civil society, ex-government officials, and industry representatives. And one thing that we articulated in that is a norm against attacks on the election infrastructure, that no country should do this, that no actor, not just a country, no actor should do this. And those are important precepts to really move us in a peaceful way into the next 20, 30 years as cyber issues and internet reliance becomes even greater. So that's really important. Now, if we look at what happened in 2016, there's a lot of debate among international lawyers, and there seems to be always debate among international lawyers or lawyers generally on what international laws were violated. I think there's, again, some who believe, and I'm one of them, that any attempt to go into the actual election infrastructure violated the principle of non-intervention. And I think that's an important thing to think about. And sovereignty plays a role there. But there is a lot of disagreement among lawyers about influence operations, what that would cover. And I think we need to really figure out more what the contours of international law are. So against that backdrop, then and international law being a key pillar in this area that needs to be developed further, and the ideas of voluntary norms forming an additional pillar that will fall under that greater rubric of international law, we're faced with another issue, which is that as much as it's important to create what the rules of the road are, as much as that is a stabilizing factor for cyberspace writ large, if there are no consequences, if there are no accountability for those who break those rules or transgress those rules, they end up being little more than words on paper. And this is true both in the cyber realm and the non-cyber realm. There needs to be accountability, there needs to be consequences. And I think this is where it's critically important for the US and countries around the world to work together, both to chart what these rules are, to talk about what are the limits, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable in cyberspace, and make sure there are consequences for those who violate it. So in that sense, I think there's been good efforts, again, as I mentioned, in these UN processes that have started under the Obama administration, or were very active in the Obama administration, they're continuing now. This idea of what norms are, what some of these rules of the road are, I think has been very, very important and good. And the US has worked with countries around the world to do this, but even outside those UN processes, we need to work with like-minded countries around the world to further articulate what these mean. So that nature of international cooperation is essential. It's also true that almost more than 40 countries around the world are building offensive cyber capabilities. And I'd say every country that can is looking at how they can build cyber capabilities to supplement their other capabilities. Now that's expected, but we need to have some understanding of how those capabilities will be used, transparency in how we can de-escalate potential conflicts when those capabilities are used, issues around attribution and other issues that are attended to the space, and states using proxies as actors. And again, I think there's been some good work with respect to that. There needs to be more discussion among countries of how cyber tools, offensive tools, and defensive tools are used, and some agreement among them, but that's still in its infancy. The last part is how we cooperate to respond to these threats, and I think that's critically important too. And again, I think there's been some good work. When I was at the State Department as our top cyber diplomat, we built a coalition of countries, and we continue to do that, of working with other countries. In this administration, there's been a cyber deterrence initiative that's tried to bring countries together. I think that's been good, but it's been hampered, unfortunately, by a lot of the actions this administration has taken to push some of our traditional allies away or to alienate them on a whole host of different issues. And it's made it harder to have this collective action, but I think there's been some progress made. And I think it's important for us to act together. If we act together, it gives more legitimacy to our response. So I mentioned if there are no consequences for bad actors, you basically are encouraging bad actors to do more. To really impose good consequences, it's better for countries to act collectively than alone. And that makes it more legitimate and also more effective. And we're seeing more of that around the world. The EU recently used something called their diplomatic toolkit to impose sanctions on a number of bad actors for nation state bad actors. So sanctions, economic tools are one, law enforcement tools are another, diplomatic tools, cyber tools, even potentially military tools, but that would have to be a very high threshold. But we need to work together to do that, to create the kind of stable cyber environment that will allow all the good things in cyberspace to prosper, social growth, economic growth, et cetera. But for all of that to happen, and particularly now bringing it back to the issue of elections, we really need to make this a national level priority and an international level priority. Too often, people think of cyber as this boutique issue that is only the province of the techies, when it really is a core issue of our national security, our economic policy, our human rights policy, our international law policy, and ultimately our diplomacy. And so we need to treat it just like that. We need to treat any attempts to interfere with or attack our elections, whether it be the infrastructures or trying to divide and conquer us by manipulating social media. We need to take those seriously as well. And we need to make that a national priority, and there has to be leadership from the top And that's an important way to thwart this, because if we don't, it's just going to get worse. With that, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
I'd like to thank our two speakers for their insightful observations on a critical issue for the 2020 election. And I want to ask you to come join us for further installments of the series and the general programming that you can find at acel.org. Thanks very much.